And I want to stop here for a minute and dive just a little bit deeper into the 9 traits of narcissism and how this can relate directly to a demonic fantasy problem. That's not even to mention like cluster A with losing touch with reality. Not to mention, guys, if when this does become demonic, of course the devil's in there playing ping pong with their brain and with their emotions. And I believe the devil will lead them first mentally and then physically from sin to sin to sin into addictive process, basically to hell, unfortunately. But this person, if they are really caught deep into a demonic fantasy that they fuel oftentimes by music or like the basically the secular entertainment realm and people who are willing to go along and make it even more powerful for them, especially with chemical addiction or being addicted to people in various ways. So in the demonic fantasy, they're not really in control is the important thing to remember. You're dealing with a person who's not fully in control. And at least part of the time, if not all of the time with these people, another thing like other spirit or spirits is in control. And there's many people over the years that I've witnessed who would be nodding their head, yes, 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 on this. Something else is going on there. A lot of times the light is on, no one's home kind of situation, not to mention what is home is very violent, aggressive, abusive, explosive at the slightest provocation. Like I say, not to even mention cluster A with serious problems with connecting with reality that a lot of them are in from time to time, which I believe the devil can do and fantasy can do. And then, of course, part of what's going on in cluster C would be attachment issues, and some of this would be from early childhood abuse, but some of it has to do with patterns and habits that you develop very strong from early childhood abuse. Like if you're always escaping into fantasy, not only are you not going to be able to know how to attach properly to anything anywhere, but as I described earlier, I believe that a person's life will become cursed if they just walk in darkness with the God of this world to various degrees. But if you just look at 9 signs and symptoms of the narcissist, and a lot of this comes from diagnostic and statistic manuals of psychology, the ones who've studied these disorders for a long time for personality disorders. And I just want to run through and explain how this can be someone walking around in fantasy land, and how you need to be aware that a lot of people that you're dealing with on every level may not even be in the room with you. They may not even be talking to you. This is part of how they don't notice you. They don't see you. You're just an object to be used in their fantasy realms. And that you are an extension of themselves is a way that some people describe it. So a number 1 sign and symptoms would be grandiosity. And the way it's described is exaggerated sense of self-importance, feeling superior to others. And quotation marks, feelings are often accompanied by fantasies. They've noticed this when the person sits in the chair and talks. Feelings are often accompanied by fantasies. I would say the fantasies are a strong addiction process with the feelings, and very often with familiar spirits. And the fantasies are often of unlimited. Notice the grandiose, notice the unlimited. We're going to get into some of that later, a little bit later, of the ideas that unstoppable, unbreakable, unshakable of themselves and others. But their fantasies are often unlimited things like success, brilliance, power, beauty, love, which a lot of people would say, what's wrong with that, right? Especially the culture that we're taught whenever we forgot about have no other gods before Jehovah God, and how all of these things come in and take the place of God in a lot of our lives, fueled by fantasy-driven entertainment industry. Warning. So, their quotation marks accompanied by fantasies. That's a big problem with the grandiose. And I believe that even when they're not walking around in a fantasy realm, the devil has told them so often. I have to say that, even though it may seem silly. The devil has told them in thoughts and feelings. This is how they come up with stuff that's just straight up bizarre, guys. That where did they get that from? And it's annoying. That's another key to me. It may not register to you guys that way, but the way it's always registered to me when someone is not in reality, and then I figure it out usually years later because I've connected some dots, is downright annoying. Why were they grating my nerves? I usually get along with people just fine. When somebody consistently grates my nerves, it usually shows up later that they're living in a fantasy world. And I don't know if that's because I'm constantly expecting a degree of accountability and reality and they annoy me, or if it's one of those unblessable traits where they annoy a lot of people. They become an annoying person because they're not God. I believe God doesn't smile on someone walking around like drunk in a fantasy land. That's like not being an adult, not being responsible. It would be kind of like God being far away from the proud, you could say, maybe. Just a theory. But these people have always been extremely annoying to me, and then I connected some dots later. Like, if somebody's coming up with a conclusion or an idea, and you're like, where did that come from? Keep in mind they may be living in an alternate reality with things literally whispering in their ear. And I cannot stress the importance of that. With spirits literally whispering in their ear. And if they're used to hearing those spirits, believing and trusting those spirits, they will believe some really messed up things. And that's why we must test the spirits, and we must test our thoughts according to the Word of God and the best truth we have, even if it's not comfortable and even if it doesn't pat our ego or our pride, because not every single nuance of what's going on in our daily life is necessarily in the Word of God explicitly, like most of it is, but even for the other little things, I believe God will reward you when you're trying to walk in the truth. He will guide you to truth when you're trying, honestly. But when you're given over to fantasies, and that is one of the most annoying, back to my rant I went on obnoxiously annoying. People who live in a fantasy world are in usually various ways obnoxiously annoying. So number one, grandiosity, accompanied by fantasies of unlimited living in a fantasy world, to the point, I think I already got into this or probably will later, of a lot of times the person close to them will complain that the narcissist had a favorite television show, movie, or video game series that they endlessly watched, and it didn't make any sense to them because they would watch the same episodes, they would watch the same movies constantly for years, and that's pretty much all they would watch. And my argument was, that's the show, that's the setting that they lived in, which is really sad because that's a perfect picture of Hollywood capturing someone's soul. And often or not, if they are that particular form of addicted, that would be a good example to see what's going on there. And this probably leads to all of these other traits that are mentioned. I just see how it could all fit in. Something like this is happening, I believe, in the fantasy world, in the fantasy mind. It's like having no false images, graven images, and false gods before the Lord. So number two would be the excessive need for admiration. Usually, too, guys, as I read these out, this is usually the kind of thing where our jaw drops. Unbelievable. Amazing. We can't imagine putting ourselves in their shoes and acting like this when there doesn't seem like we're trying to come up with excuses for them desperately because there doesn't seem to be a reason. And also, it's something that it's so bizarre and out of left field that unless we have a whole lot of direct abuse on us, or unless we've seen it before, obviously, and we know what we're dealing with, when it's just that foreign, we usually make tons of excuses for it and just don't really get it. It has to get so bad. We don't really understand it. And for what it is, the narcissism. But excessive need for admiration. And another thing, too, is in some people with weak personalities, or, they're bent a certain way, we come to know them as, well, that's just Brandon, or that's just Todd, or that's just Emily, and that's just how they are, and we'll blend it in with our idea of them. It'll be somehow or other justified or excused rather than identified because it's so jaw-dropping. So if you're living in a fantasy world where you're constantly getting unlimited success, brilliance, power, beauty, and love, that's why in the real world, once more, this is cursing yourself. This is not blessable. It is rotten fruit. You go around demanding excessive need of admiration from everyone because you're addicted in your fantasy to always getting everyone's admiration. And it's listed out by psychology. You must be the center of attention. A lot of times you will monopolize the conversation. And whenever the person is ignored, that's when they're injured. They'll feel especially slighted, mistreated, or ignored, and they'll be enraged. Instead of, oh, well, that person was busy and they had something going on because their world is super important too. Instead of it being like that, it's, oh my goodness. And it's not, it's understandable. I've literally talked to people that I felt like they were slighting me on purpose, or they were really deep in a personal issue that was so deep that they were, it took everything they could to try to hold a nice conversation with me, because I was basically like mostly a stranger to them. So either they had something really going on in their personal world that was just taking everything from them that they couldn't share with people, and they were trying really hard to put on a good face, or they were deliberately slighting me. And even then, like, everyone can feel slighted, but this is like to a whole nother level. Even at that point, I just made an excuse for that person. I noticed that something was off in our conversation, in our interaction. I just noted that something wasn't quite flowing normally. They were either deliberately slighting me because they were holding something against me, or they were just having some personal stuff happening that was way too heavy for them to be able to interact normally. I mean, these people, whenever they're not even really being ignored, they're enraged because they should have been worshipped. The little things, like this evil person who attacked me, just had it in his mind, because it's a two-way street. Not only do they think other people are jealous of them, they're jealous of other people at an unreal level. Unreal. And some of this, I believe, just has to be demonic, because how on earth do human emotions get that wild? Unless they're just infused demonically. And so this person thought that other people were enraged out of their mind when he forgot to shake their hand, because that's what he would do. That's how he would act. And since he was like a preacher in a church, I'm giving this example. Half the time, I'm going out of a side door not shaking the preacher's hand, because I figure he is busy with 50,000 people trying to constantly ask him everything. And so, that's interesting. This excessive need for admiration, because they're living in a la-la land, not to mention their emotions are demonically infused. Number 3, superficial exploitative relationships. And I believe the relationships are much more easy to be superficial and not real and not intimate when someone is lost in fantasy or lost in a realm somewhere else, totally gone. Some of this can be chalked up to immaturity, but I'm just saying how much, or underdevelopment or development wrong from abuse, however you want to look at it. But how much of this might be from living in a demonic fantasy, because your relationship is with these evil spirits and not with the person in front of you. And this reminds me of what a lot of people talk about with spirit husbands and wives. The spirit husband and wife is an extremely good example of what I'm talking about, where somewhere, whether they know it or not, whether it's a literal spiritual thing, attacks other people and keeps them away from them so that they can't be a good spouse. So that spirit gets to maintain some kind of a spouse relationship with the narcissist or the victim. It's kind of the same if you're caught up in this fantasy land at a level of depth of color and emotion and nuance and day-to-day life, with constantly walking around in a movie, in a skit, in a whatever video game, novel. I think I've seen this described as a pet fantasy before, also in a diagnostic material, a pet fantasy. And I think some of them may have a pet fantasy, and other ones may jump from fantasy to fantasy, trying to stay high like you would on a drug. But the people around you are going to be used like objects to try to fulfill that fantasy and become part of it. It's not going to be normal interaction. They're not going to wait and see. They're going to expect you to be high with them. And if you can be high on life or high on love or high somehow or other at the same emotional and energy level with them for a little while, it'll work for a little while. But eventually fantasy is not real. No one's going to actually be in a movie with them walking around. It's just not going to work. And it's cursed. It's not to mention you will have demonic sabotage of a real relationship. What I'm reading here from emedicinehealth.com says relationships are based on surface attribute and not the unique qualities of others, because they don't see you. They're seeing fantasy, and they want quick, fast, easy, and it's not real. People are only valued to the extent they are viewed as beneficial. Super selfish, obviously. Feeding an addiction or feeding a habit. Whether they're trying to have you live in the fantasy with them, or that they're addicted to feelings that fantasy gives them that you better match. Something like that. Number 4, lack of empathy, which just comes with all of it. Severely limited, totally lacking ability to care about the emotional needs or experiences of others, even loved ones. I mean, this can go so far, you guys probably already know, that they're literally, not only are they just blind toward you and unvalidating many times, but sometimes they even have to be sadistic or putting you down constantly and punishing you constantly. And I would say that's also very demonic and wicked, whether they know it or not. Because I believe a lot of times these spirits will have them hating you, having bad feelings toward you, and misinterpreting everything you're doing on purpose. One of the signs that I had with this particular person that I believe lived somewhere in a fantasy realm, God gave me a lot of very interesting hints. Like sometimes he would be, if you guys want to go watch my video on identifying demonic fantasy, that's kind of where I described kind of some things that happened with him in more detail, if you're interested in that at all. But he would do things like come and have these conversations with me that we weren't even having, if that makes sense. Just things that had nothing to do with our reality, but had to do with the reality in his head. But he needed me to be a sounding board. He needed me to emotionally invest, to try to give back to the magical thinking and the magical power of magical thinking in delusion land. The symbology gives it more power when other people are participating, if you will. It's bizarre. But number 5, identity disturbance, comes from a lot of things like abuse, but it says sense of self is highly superficial, rigid, and fragile. It's because it's not real. It's not realistic. Of course, this is why they'll explode quickly, because it's fragile. And they can only be stable if they maintain the view that they're exceptional, because that's their whole identity, is whatever their fantasy and the devil is feeding them. I did a video one time called "The Devil's Got Their Mind," because of how deep it goes. That we had a friend of the family, this poor guy would come, this was like decades ago before I even knew about a lot of this, but he would come visit us and he would sit in the corner and he would just be gone. And we would all be having conversations and chilling out and having a good time, and he would just not even interact with anyone at all until suddenly, when he was ready to go, he'd say, "Well, it's been nice," and he would leave. He was just weird. And then, and he was probably about 30 years older than us, 35. So when my sister, who he's probably 35 years older than, comes up with a boyfriend, oh, he was mad, and he left and just blew his gasket and stormed off. And we were like, "What?" We were like, "Are you okay? What's wrong? Like, are you having an emergency?" And he came back and laughed and pretended to act like he wasn't very angry. And we realized he was living in some kind of fantasy world where my sister was his girlfriend or wife, and no one had a clue. This is the kind of thing. I'm trying to give bizarre, outlandish examples to help you guys understand the different degrees at which people can do this, and why their identity can be disturbed, because they're caught up in a world that's not even real. And I have always been curious, how much does the good old-fashioned theater and movie theater have to do with training people to live this way more easily? And it's just curious to me. I've always been curious about that. And you could argue novels and books. And it also says here below the identity disturbance that the grandiose sense of their self is easily threatened. This is back to where they cannot stand reality, and they become control freaks about that. And anything that challenges their grandiosity, they'll, of course, not just retreat from and deny, but they'll have explosive narcissistic rage if it's coming from a significant other. So the identity is severely played with, because they can't have much of an identity to be giving themselves completely over to a demonic fantasy anyway. And then what the devil will give them is super fake, but they're super addicted to it at the same time. So they'll fight and fight for it, but it's easily challenged and defeated. So that's kind of all sad. But number 6 is they'll have a difficulty with attaching and dependency and which means that the only way they're going to relate to you is to worship themselves, basically. It's all very superficial, and they don't have intimacy, even though that makes them crave intimacy more. Or even if they don't know that's what they're craving, they dive deeper into the addiction easier. So just everything being unhealthy from being so addicted to something in the spirit world going on. Chronic feeling of emptiness and boredom. I would say some of this could be just like a drug addict. What makes them keep going back and keep going back? Because an addiction like that is going to destroy you. It's going to tear you down. You're going to know it. You're going to feel it. When you're not high, you're low. And when you're not high on a feeling or a new fantasy, or it's kind of like an extreme of let's just say that you binge watch something on Netflix, a series. But let's just say you're the kind of person that you can watch a bunch of Netflix like that, or whatever your favorite little binge watching thing would be, YouTube's or whatever, Lifetime movies or something, and you would get caught up into the story. But later on that day, you would be back with your family and back to your hobbies and back to your job, and you wouldn't be thinking about it anymore. You just had like a temporary reprieve. Whereas someone who would be more like addicted to that same stimulus, they would have a letdown, like a very serious letdown, and they would need to have their next fix and their next feed, and they would need to be in their next storyline. And they would constantly be having to be in the next fantasy, into the next stimulation of some kind. And of course, whenever their fantasy would be based on their success, brilliance, power, beauty, and love, when they're not having inner success, brilliance, power, beauty, and love, and sometimes I've argued, sometimes they live in a fantasy like overtly, is what I call it, when they're like pretending that they're in a movie or whatever. And sometimes I say it's covert, in which they've found other ways to validate a fantasy world that's not even real, but they're not necessarily getting it from fiction, if you will, or from manufactured fiction. They may even actually make themselves a real CEO in real life that drives a real fancy car and always has lots of women, or whatever the fantasy would be here with success, brilliance, power, beauty, and love. They may get a bunch of plastic surgeries. That may be the stereotype, and that may be kind of how they've propped themselves up, in a fake way, in a false way. That has very little to do with another kind of fantasy world, but it could work the same way, and I've called that covert and overt, possibly. But the emptiness and boredom would come with the natural crash from the high. Not to mention, just like a drug addiction, what they were high on does not help them. It subtracts massively in various ways. Like a drug they may be high on would wreck their health, or wreck their relationships, or wreck their bank account, or whatever, wreck their job or their productivity. Well, in other ways, a fantasy world that you're really high on would kind of do the same thing. It's not fulfilling, it's not sustaining, it's not enriching, like something real would be. And then there's going to be the down times from the superficial high. So I believe this is why you have the chronic emptiness and boredom, and that's why you see a lot of them being thrill chasers and all of this. Or insatiable, because nothing fills them, because they haven't trained themselves to be in reality and with God in reality, and getting enriched with people in true intimacy and reality the proper way. They haven't practiced that. They're addicted to jumping on fake thrills. And so whenever true reality comes, they don't know how to interact with that, kind of like they don't know how to be intimate, period. So this is where the emptiness and boredom comes from. And it says here, when attention and praise are not available, they feel empty, bored, depressed, and restless. When they're not getting their supply of their unlimited success, brilliance, power, beauty, and love, especially at a certain level. Like they say, a prime or a grade A source of supply would give them. This would be like the person who may sit there and watch their movies that they're addicted to, or whatever it would be. That would be why they would want the supply to be there and be treating them a certain way, and why they may feel like they need like several supplies, not just one, as far as a person or a lover. or just someone to be there giving them whatever holds them up in that way, because supplies can be giving them, fulfilling part of their fantasy of success, brilliance, power, beauty, love, and or catching their misery and catching the fallout in the other areas of their life from the inevitable damage that this does. So they could be doing several roles. That's why they say a lot of times that the supply must be there to stabilize the narcissistic type person. And sometimes the way that they stabilize is they abuse the person, and that somehow makes them feel better, which could also be demonic. Number 8 is saying vulnerability to life transitions, difficulty maintaining reality-based goals. I've seen this a lot whenever people need to have a certain standard in their life, artificially and superficially. Like, for example, they would go deep into debt to make sure their car looks a certain way, go deep into debt to get a bunch of plastic surgery, or a lot of other different things. That's just an example of things that interrupt their goals, because they're constantly having to put everything on hold and have this priority that's unrealistic and throw all their resources into it. And so everything else kind of crumbles. The goals cannot be healthy, not to mention if they're not goal-oriented, because they're fantasy-oriented. And it says here, compromises that are required by school, jobs, relationships may feel unbearable. Or commitments may feel unbearable. I think it's what it's trying to say there, because you're not chasing hardcore, running after with everything you have, and chasing a fantasy of unlimited success, power. There's a lot of real life that has to go way on the back burner to try to put everything. Like, imagine the parent of a small child, and they're trying to make that child into like a beauty queen contestant, or the top in their sports in the land or whatever, and they're constantly paying all these top quality coaches, and they're traveling far and wide. And imagine everything, and I'm not saying necessarily that's wrong, it's just a good example of chasing something to the max, to the supreme, to the most idealistic means you put a lot of stuff, either it doesn't happen or it's going way on a back burner, because you just don't have the resources for anything else. It's priority, and the priority is not going to be a lot of times long-term commitment that works with, good goals. But it says young adults may have a failure to launch, and that there's a significant risk for suicide and suicidal attempts. That's sad, but those are the symptoms. And the actual diagnosis is what most people look at, guys. These are the 9 traits that most people look at to say, is the person that I'm dealing with, if you can get 5 of these 9, you probably have someone diagnosable. And I would say these days, if you have a scattering in there, you probably have a narcissist. They may not be NPD, but they may be very difficult and not worth it, But the 9 traits is a grandiose sense of self-importance. Number 2, preoccupation with fantasies, with everything I listed before, of ideal and unlimited things. So the fantasy is one of the 9 traits, guys. The psychologists have already figured this out. Number 3, believing themselves to be very special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions. Like, they literally see people as beneath them. Because I do believe people can become very unique and very skilled and very extremely unique, but they can have a healthy appreciation that other people are also very unique, or that doesn't make them above anyone else, that kind of thing. Like, one example I've used is somebody can become a very good concert pianist and play the piano extremely very well, but if they can understand that they can associate with other people that don't, and they can even find that enriching and rewarding, and they can learn something from other people, and they can have their mind broadened by interacting with other people that are having accomplishments on other areas and levels, or just seeing what's going on in the world with other people. And it's different than saying I'm above, I'm better, I'm at a high status that makes me important, and these people are just not even important, for example. So the special and unique, as long as it doesn't become better than, high, more deserving than, I need to be worshipped, resources should all go to me and never to you, or I'm angry. Number 4, it requires excessive admiration. Number 5, a sense of entitlement. Number 6, interpersonally exploitative, taking advantage of others constantly and having no problem with it, deliberately doing it. Number 7, lacking empathy. Number 8, envies others. This is the part 2, guys, all these, jaw-dropping. Jaw-dropping, constant, and we don't know what we're dealing with. We're trying to find a reason they did that day, and surely they're not always this way, right? And here's the one that's interesting. Number 8, envies others or believes others are envious of them. And I would say they do both. Because they envy others viciously, they're assuming that, of course, you're envious of me. And number 9, arrogant, haughty. Wow. I'm thinking about the one who attacked me. I called him Señor Orgulloso, which is like Mr. Arrogant, since he bragged about speaking Spanish. And I called him Lobo Orgulloso because he was like a proud, arrogant wolf. And I'm telling you, the arrogance and the haughtiness that came out when God was showing me the demonic stronghold of pride and bitterness was a demonic spirit coming off a preacher. And I'm just saying that I didn't know where to put it. I was making the total excuses for that person. They were just having a bad day. They're not always like that. And I was automatically making the excuses. And I'm glad I was, because it proved how innocent my mind was. I was automatically, without even meaning to, not seeing. Amazed, my jaw was on the floor, but I still couldn't see it. So, grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with the fantasy. They're special and above people, and they belong in they like to associate. I think the reason that it's saying associating with groups of other higher and special people is because they feel a spiritual power in that arrogance. And they want, whenever they're with the other people that feel it too, it heightens the feelings, which is what they're addicted to. It heightens that feeling of power. And it's all just like sometimes I think they may try to associate with people on purpose in order to get refueled in a way. And that whenever they're idealizing a supply, they're thinking that supply is going to fuel them in that way. Until, of course, they can't or don't, because no one will. Because the reason I say this is ever so often I get a peek into some of these worlds. Like I'll get a sensation or a feeling and I'll be like, wow, that explains their behavior. They're kind of living in this emotional high realm with these other people even. I've seen people brown nose, name drop, go to conventions, try to catch up with other people that they think are like a name drop like this one preacher that abused me would constantly name drop and brown nose. And once he caught on that I saw him going to the conferences, he would even try to hide it on social media a little bit. But he was, because he's very thin-skinned and sensitive to things like that. But he would literally in his sermons talk about, make sure to go out of his way to say that he shook hands with a man that did a prayer breakfast with Trump. And constantly in his sermons trying to make himself look as important as possible. Come on. Number 4, requires excessive admiration. Constantly collecting the admiration. Number 5, a sense of entitlement. A lot of this is just pride, self-important, prideful, haughty, arrogant, wicked. Number 6, takes advantage of others. 7, lacking empathy. 8, envies others, believe others are envious of them. And 9, the haughty, arrogant pride. And another reason they're so easily exploitative and it becomes a habit is because nothing can uphold the outrageous pride other than constant theft and, the fantasy. It requires theft. And that's what that is. And back to, they don't have the right goals and priorities, so things don't work, so they have to steal from other people. An extreme example would be the person that's traveling far and wide for this unrealistic goal, this outrageous goal. You could argue a very fleshly, selfish goal. That's them if they're not hurting anyone. That's their path if they're not hurting anyone. But when they're willing to take advantage of a whole bunch of people in order to fulfill a certain selfish goal. Some idea like that. So, these are the 9 traits that you can diagnose the narcissist, if they just have at least 5 of those 9 that you can tell and see. Back to, though, fantasy. That's one of the 9 that the psychologists have figured out. They're often addicted to living in a fantasy, and I'm saying that it's probably very spiritual. And it leads to all the other problems of being addicted to being so important, having a false belief system that you're that important, having a false belief system that you're that much better than everyone else. You're that much more higher, important. That leads to you demand the admiration. You're very entitled over them. Of course you take advantage of them. Who are they? And you don't have empathy toward them. And the arrogance. And then, of course, the envy. So that's my argument, is that, or at least an eye-opener that I would try to give people, is how much of this is a demonic fantasy that is infused and empowered by the spirit world. Usually when there's this much sin, then there is a, you're being led around, basically, like I'm arguing in my videos, by the gods of this world, and blinded. You're being blinded. Anytime there's that much pride, there's blindness by the god of this world, and not delivered by the brilliance of the truth, of the true Lord Jesus. That these are the kind of things that must be confessed, repented, turned from, an admission that this is not reality. But being this stuck into a daydream is not reality. It is against God. It's an enemy of God. Your mind is an enemy of God, and that you don't want to live like that. You don't want the high that it gives you, the special feeling and the important, safe feeling that it gives you. Because a lot of people get stuck, like in a fragment like this, from very early violent, horrible abuse. Horrible abuse. That's why I won't say that it's your typical Romans reprobate mind given over necessarily every time, and that God has a lot of mercy and lets people repent. And so, yeah, I believe this is what's going on, and I wish people would talk more about it, and I wish it was more of a known topic.